even Secretary of State Marco Rubio is like, okay, based on who's being sent from Ukraine and Russia, this isn't going to go anywhere. They're not ending this war serious.
A lot of this is miscommunication and intentional miscommunication on the European and Ukraine side. Russia never offered for Putin to go and meet Zelensky. Never did. In fact, this came after Zelensky and the 4 European leaders from France, Germany, Poland, and France that said, hey, we demand a ceasefire, an unconditional 30-day ceasefire on Monday, or we're going to levy all these sanctions. And Putin just said, yeah, we're not doing that. But I tell you what we will do is we'll have direct negotiations for the first time since 2022 between our side and their side. That's all he offered. And then Zelensky comes back on and says, oh, yeah, well, I'm going to come there and you better come there, Putin, or everyone's going to know that you're afraid of me, which is what he said. Zelensky has said this. And Putin just said, never offered that. And you're a lunatic if you think that that was ever on the table. Heads of state don't meet until all of the lower delegations have arranged nearly everything, and they come out to make the final negotiations or to present whatever was agreed upon. Nobody does it that way, but that's how it was presented over here. But what has been reported on both Ukraine and Russian media, as well as some in European, is that both sides said, all right, we're going to come in, we want to meet. The meeting is good. It's the first time you had direct negotiations since April 2022. But they said, all right, we're going to present our side. The Ukraine is, here's the 30-day ceasefire that we want. And then the Russian side said, fair enough, that's what you want. Here's what we want. We'll agree to that. Putin said this before the meeting, as long as our caveats and conditions are attached to it. Not an unconditional, that's not even on the table. But then came the real killer for the Ukraine side, as they said, our deal is basically the same one that was from June of last year, almost unchanged. You withdraw from all of the 4 administrative borders of the oblasts that we have annexed, and that means that a lot of territory that they still control, you're going to have to walk away from all of that. You're going to have to demilitarize down to a very low number, and you're going to have to denazify according to whatever terms that they want, and, of course, no NATO. That's what the Russian side said. Or, and this is the new part, we will continue fighting, and then we will probably take all of another oblast, the 5th one in Kharkiv, and most or possibly all of Sumy in the north. And they threw in later on possibly Zaporizhzhia in the south. So they're saying you can either take this, what's considered an ugly deal from our side now, or we'll keep fighting until we get what we want, and then we won't negotiate about that. That was, I think, the biggest takeaway from this that has only gotten a little bit of press so far.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. So it sounds like Zelensky and some of the countries in the European Union side of NATO, they don't really want this thing to come to an end. It sounds like they were almost trying to humiliate Putin, like, oh, like, you know, in Back to the Future, what are you, yellow? What are you, a chicken? You know, like, you won't show up in Turkey. And he's like, what are you guys talking about? Okay, so that makes more sense why Marco Rubio was saying, like, nothing's going to happen. The level of diplomacy that you guys are sending to Turkey, it's a joke. You guys are wasting people's time. I'm instructing President Trump to fly home. This is not happening. Putin's not coming. Zelensky, what are you doing? Like, do you think they're just trying to buy time, hoping President Trump will somehow have a change of heart and say, we're going to fund you with a bunch more money and weapons?
I do. And I've talked to a number of European sources that I have that they say they are so mortified by Trump coming into office, and they thought they were going to get Kamala Harris and Biden too, basically. And some of them are so deluded that they actually think that they can just drag this thing out for another 4 years until they can hopefully get in a Democrat after that, which I'm not sure that that's a good prospect to hope for anyway. But they actually are doing everything. You're right. This stuff was in your face for Putin, demanding that you do the stuff that they don't have any leverage to compel and force them to do so. So you have to say, okay, the New York Times had a piece out just Wednesday, I think it was, of this week, where it said, hey, Russia is asking for miles in negotiation, but they're only moving force inches on the battlefield. And they don't understand that Russia is fighting an attritional war. They're not fighting a traditional American version of how we would fight, which is a territorial war. Their objective is to wear down the Ukrainian army and kill as many of them as possible. But then even the New York Times admitted that as of April the 1st, the previous 16 months, Russia had captured 1,800 square miles of Ukrainian territory and killed, and they didn't mention this part, but I know that they've killed hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian men over this time, weakening the fabric of the Ukrainian military. They can't force mobilize enough people to even offset the losses, so they are continuing to shrink while Russia's is continuing to grow in every category. So yeah, you can push this thing off, but you'll be lucky if you get through the summer before a collapse of the armed forces. And even the New York Times admitted that, well, there is a possibility that the Ukraine side could become so weak because it doesn't have enough men or enough ammunition, and it collapses. It's odd that they're pointing a finger at Russia at the same time they're admitting, but yeah, there is a path to success for the Russian side here, and there's not one for the Ukraine side. And what bothers me the most, Stephen, is that I consider what the Western and in the Ukraine leadership doing is immoral and illogical and unethical, because they are saying we're going to try and just drag this thing out longer, oblivious to this horrific casualties and the death and the blood that they're being inflicted by the Ukrainian people alone, the cities that are being destroyed, and it continues to advance. So more cities are getting blown up, and they could potentially lose everything up to the Dnieper River. So this could get a much, much worse. And if they have this fantasy of dragging it out, I don't think they're going to. And one last thing I'll point out, which is why I think this is delusional, and I hope Trump sticks with this. You had Rubio on the 18th of April, on the 27th April, say we are days away from walking away from this. If Trump doesn't think that the two sides can close that gap, he's just going to walk away and say, you guys got it. On March the 1st, you had Tammy Bruce, the State Department official, say, she said, we're out of the mediating business. We're not just going to fly to every city every time there's an opportunity. They're going to have to figure this out. Well, obviously, it wasn't quite that way, since Rubio was in Turkey today to do that very thing. But he again said at the end that if we can't see an end to this, we might walk. And that's, I think, the only thing, if Trump makes good on that and walks away, because Biden or Putin is not going to change his view. Putin has all the cards and all the leverage. He doesn't have to give in to any of these things, and he's not going to. And I think if Trump recognizes that, if he goes and meets him, I'm not sure I would agree with that. I wouldn't recommend that, because if they meet together and then Putin gets all he wants, then it makes it look like Trump was weak. I think Trump should just say, hey, if you can't narrow this gap, and if anything, the gap is getting wider, then I think you should say, I'm not going to continue to underwrite failure. If you guys want to keep fighting, that's on you. But I'm not going to do that anymore. I hope that he does that. That's probably the only thing that can get the Europeans and the Ukraine to finally realize they don't have the means to continue resisting, and then they'll find a solution. Until that time, they'll keep on letting more Ukrainian men die for nothing.